Good evening, dear friends, and tonight I have a story that will make you question everything you think you know about the quiet women in your life. What would you do if you discovered that your perfect marriage was built on lies? What if the man you trusted with your heart, your home, and your future had been living a double life right under your nose? Most women would cry, confront, or simply walk away. But Sarah Morrison wasn't most women. When Sarah's world crumbled in the most public, humiliating way possible, her husband made one critical mistake. He assumed she was just another helpless wife who would quietly disappear into the background. He had no idea who he had really married. This is the story of what happens when the wrong woman gets betrayed by the wrong man. It's about patience, intelligence, and the kind of revenge that's not just sweet. It's absolutely devastating. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning on that terrible night when Sarah's perfect life shattered into a million pieces. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll never underestimate a quiet woman again. The crystal chandelier in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel cast dancing shadows across the marble floor as I stood frozen watching my husband of 10 years destroy our marriage in front of 200 of the most influential people in Chicago's real estate community. The annual Morrison Development Company Anniversary Gala was supposed to be David's crowning moment, a celebration of the empire we'd built together, brick by brick, deal by deal, dream by dream. Instead, it became the night he chose to publicly execute our life together. Ladies and gentlemen, David's voice boomed through the microphone, his perfectly practiced smile never wavering as he stood on the raised platform where moments earlier he'd been accepting congratulations for landing the largest commercial development contract in the city's history. Before we continue tonight's celebration, I have a personal announcement to make. My champagne glass trembled in my hand as something cold and sharp twisted in my stomach. David's steel gray eyes found mine across the crowded room, and in them I saw something I'd never seen before. Not love, not even indifference, but something that looked almost like pity. As many of you know, success in business requires difficult decisions. He continued, his voice carrying that same authoritative tone he used during board meetings. Sometimes we outgrow situations that once served us well. Tonight, I'm announcing that Sarah and I will be divorcing effective immediately. The ballroom fell silent except for the soft clink of glasses being set down on tables and the whispered intake of breath from 200 shocked guests. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, watching for my reaction, waiting to see how the abandoned wife would handle this public humiliation. But David wasn't finished. I'd also like to introduce someone very special to me, he said, his tone warming in a way it hadn't when he spoke my name. Ms. Jessica Martinez has been instrumental in our company's recent success, and I'm proud to announce that she'll be taking on expanded responsibilities in both our professional and personal lives. A stunning young woman with glossy black hair and a figure that belonged in a magazine emerged from behind the velvet curtains at the side of the stage. She couldn't have been more than 25, wearing a red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being watched, admired, desired. The crowd's shocked silence erupted into whispered conversations as Jessica took David's outstretched hand and allowed him to pull her close to his side. She looked out at the audience with a confident smile that suggested she was exactly where she belonged, next to a successful man who could give her everything she wanted. Jessica brings a fresh perspective to everything she touches. David continued, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. She's brilliant, innovative, and represents the future direction of Morrison Development. I stood there in my navy blue dress, the one David had helped me select, because he said it made me look appropriately professional for company events, and watched my husband of 10 years replace me like I was outdated office equipment. The guests began to murmur among themselves, some looking uncomfortable, others clearly enjoying the drama unfolding before them. Margaret Chin, the wife of David's biggest investor, leaned toward her husband and whispered something that made him shake his head in disgust. Carolyn Morrison, David's own sister, covered her face with her hands as if she couldn't bear to watch. But others in the crowd, particularly some of the younger men, nodded approvingly, as if David had made a shrewd business decision by trading up to a newer model. I want to thank Sarah for her contributions during the early years of our company. David said, his tone now carrying the dismissive politeness he reserved for employees who were being terminated. She's been a valuable asset, and I wish her well in her future endeavors. Valuable asset. 10 years of marriage, and I'd been reduced to corporate jargon. The applause that followed was scattered and uncomfortable, more out of social obligation than genuine approval. David beamed as if he'd just announced a merger that would double the company's profits, completely oblivious to, or perhaps uncaring about, the shock and disapproval rippling through the room. But what David didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the quiet, supportive wife standing in the back of the ballroom, clutching her champagne glass, wasn't actually a wife at all. My name is Sarah Chin Morrison, and for the past 10 years, I've been living the most successful undercover operation of my career. Because while David Morrison thinks he married a sweet, compliant accountant who was grateful to handle the books for his small construction business, he actually married a former senior financial crimes analyst for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A woman who spent 12 years tracking down white-collar criminals, money launderers, and sophisticated financial fraudsters before making the decision to step away from active duty and try to build a normal life. A woman whose expertise in forensic accounting and criminal financial patterns would make her very, very dangerous to someone who had something to hide. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd fallen in love with and married a man in the exact industry I'd spent years investigating. But 10 years ago, David Morrison had been different, or at least I believed he was different. He was running a small, honest construction company, building affordable housing for working families, and taking pride in quality craftsmanship over maximum profit. The man standing on that stage publicly humiliating his wife while announcing his affair with a woman young enough to be his daughter bore little resemblance to the David Morrison I thought I'd married. I met David in 2014 at a community meeting about affordable housing development in Chicago's South Side. I was there in my civilian capacity, having recently left the FBI and moved to Chicago to start fresh. I was 35 years old, burned out from years of chasing financial criminals through labyrinthine paper trails, and desperate to find something real and honest to build my life around. David was presenting his company's proposal to build a complex of energy-efficient townhomes for first-time home buyers. He was passionate, articulate, and genuinely committed to creating housing that families could actually afford. When someone in the audience challenged his numbers, questioning whether his company could really deliver quality construction at the proposed price point, David didn't get defensive or evasive. Instead, he opened his books right there in the meeting, spreading financial statements across the table and walking through every line item with the transparency of someone who had nothing to hide. "I'm not trying to get rich off this project," he'd said, his gray eyes earnest as he addressed the skeptical crowd. "I want to build something that matters, something that helps families put down roots in their own community. My profit margin is built into these numbers, and it's fair but not excessive. Anyone who wants to examine our financial records is welcome to do so." I was impressed by his openness, his passion, and his apparent integrity. After the meeting, I approached him to compliment his presentation, and we ended up talking over coffee until the restaurant closed around us. "What do you do?" David had asked as we walked to our cars in the parking lot. "I'm an accountant," I'd replied, which was technically true. I had a CPA in addition to my FBI credentials, and after years of analyzing complex financial crimes, corporate accounting felt refreshingly straightforward. Really? David's face had lit up with genuine excitement. We're actually looking for someone to help us streamline our financial systems. Would you be interested in consulting with us? That consulting arrangement led to a full-time position managing Morrison Development's finances. Working closely with David, I was impressed by his business ethics and his commitment to transparency. When he asked me out 6 months later, I said yes, because I believed I'd found someone whose values aligned with my own. Our courtship was wonderful. David was attentive, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions about everything from architecture to social policy. He never seemed threatened by my intelligence or my analytical approach to problems. When I told him I'd previously worked for the government in financial analysis, a deliberately vague description of my FBI career, he was supportive and impressed rather than intimidated. "I love that you see things other people miss," he'd said one evening as we reviewed plans for a new housing development. "You catch problems before they become disasters. That's a rare gift." We married 18 months after we met in a simple ceremony at the Chicago Botanic Garden, surrounded by David's family and the few close friends I'd made since moving to the city. David's parents, Robert and Patricia Morrison, were polite but reserved, clearly wondering what their successful son saw in a quiet accountant from California who had no family connections or inherited wealth to contribute to the Morrison legacy. But David seemed genuinely in love with me, and I believed I was in love with him. For the first few years of our marriage, that belief sustained us through the challenges of building a business and establishing ourselves in Chicago's competitive real estate market. I threw myself into Morrison Development with the same analytical intensity I'd once applied to FBI cases. I streamlined our accounting systems, identified inefficiencies in our supply chain management, and developed financial projections that helped David secure increasingly larger loans and contracts. My forensic accounting background proved invaluable in navigating complex commercial real estate deals and ensuring our contracts protected us from potential fraud or misrepresentation. David appreciated my contributions and frequently credited me with helping transform his small construction company into a major player in Chicago's development scene. Our business partnership was seamless, built on mutual respect and shared goals. Our personal partnership seemed equally strong. We bought a beautiful brownstone in Lincoln Park, filled it with carefully chosen art and furniture, and hosted dinner parties that became legendary among Chicago's business community. David was an attentive husband who remembered my preferences, supported my interests, and seemed genuinely proud to introduce me as his wife and business partner. But somewhere around our 5th year of marriage, things began to shift in ways so subtle I almost didn't notice them at first. David started making decisions about the business without consulting me, claiming he didn't want to burden me with every operational detail. He began taking meetings with potential clients and investors alone, saying he preferred to handle the relationship building, while I focused on the financial analysis. "You're so much better with numbers than people," he'd say, when I asked about being excluded from important meetings. "I don't want to waste your time with all the schmoozing and small talk. Let me handle the politics while you work your magic with the spreadsheets." At first, I was flattered by his confidence in my analytical abilities, but gradually I realized that David was systematically removing me from any role that involved external visibility or decision-making authority. I was becoming the behind-the-scenes numbers person, while he positioned himself as the face and voice of Morrison Development. The change accelerated after we landed our first major commercial contract, a mixed-use development project that would establish Morrison Development as a serious player in Chicago's competitive market. David's confidence grew along with our company's profile, and with that confidence came a subtle but unmistakable shift in how he viewed our partnership. Sarah handles all our financial analysis, became his standard introduction when meeting with new clients or investors. She's brilliant with numbers, keeps us on budget and on schedule. I don't know what I'd do without her attention to detail. The compliments were genuine, but they also served to pigeonhole me as a support function rather than a strategic partner. David began making increasingly important decisions without consulting me, then presenting them as fait accompli during our weekly business meetings. "I've committed us to the Riverside project," he'd announced, sliding a contract across the table. The client wanted a quick turnaround on the proposal, so I couldn't wait for our usual review process. When I raised concerns about taking on projects without proper financial analysis, David would dismiss my caution as excessive worry rather than professional expertise. "You tend to overthink things, sweetheart," he'd say with a patronizing smile. "Sometimes you have to trust your instincts and move fast when opportunities arise." The endearment felt increasingly condescending, as if he was humoring a nervous child rather than consulting with a partner who had more experience analyzing complex financial arrangements than he did. Our social dynamic began to reflect this professional shift. At industry events and dinner parties, David would introduce me as "my wife Sarah, who keeps our books in order," rather than as his business partner or co-founder. When other guests tried to engage me in conversations about real estate trends or development strategies, David would often interrupt to redirect the discussion. "Sarah's more interested in the financial side than the creative aspects," he'd explain, as if my expertise in forensic accounting somehow disqualified me from having opinions about architecture or urban planning. I began to feel like a prop in David's carefully constructed image of success, attractive enough to reflect well on his personal life, competent enough to handle the unglamorous work of financial management, but not significant enough to share credit for our company's achievements. The warning signs were all there, scattered across years of subtle changes in David's behavior and attitude. But I was so invested in our partnership, both personal and professional, that I convinced myself these shifts were natural growing pains as our business expanded and David's public profile increased. I told myself that David was simply adapting to the demands of leadership, that his increasing confidence was a positive development rather than arrogance, that his protective attitude toward my role in the company reflected his respect for my expertise rather than his desire to marginalize my influence. Looking back, I can see that my FBI training should have made me more suspicious of the gradual changes in David's behavior patterns, but the same analytical skills that made me excellent at detecting financial fraud in strangers somehow failed me when it came to recognizing deception in my own husband. Or perhaps I simply didn't want to see what was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone else. The first concrete evidence that something was seriously wrong came on a Tuesday evening in March, 3 weeks before the anniversary gala that would destroy our marriage in front of 200 witnesses. David had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter when he went upstairs to shower after a long day of client meetings. This was unusual. David was typically very protective of his devices, always closing them and securing them with passwords when he wasn't actively using them. I was preparing dinner and needed to check our calendar to confirm the timing for a client presentation we were giving the following day. Without thinking, I moved his laptop closer to where I was working and touched the trackpad to wake up the screen. Instead of David's usual business desktop, the laptop displayed an open email program with a conversation thread that made my blood run cold. The emails were between David and someone named Jessica Martinez, and they were decidedly not about business. "I can't stop thinking about last night. Read the most recent message sent just 2 hours earlier. The way you touched me in your office after everyone left. When can we do that again?" David's response, sent from his phone while he was supposedly in a client meeting, was even more explicit. "Tomorrow night, Sarah thinks I'm working late on the Henderson proposal. We'll have the office to ourselves after 8 p.m. I stood frozen in my kitchen, staring at words that shattered 10 years of marriage in the span of 30 seconds. But as the initial shock began to fade, my FBI training kicked in with the cold, analytical clarity that had once made me one of the Bureau's most effective financial investigators. This wasn't just an affair. The tone of these emails, the casual way they discussed deceiving me, the apparent routine nature of their encounters, this suggested a relationship that had been ongoing for months, possibly longer. I scrolled up through the conversation thread, my hands steady despite the emotional earthquake occurring inside my chest. The earliest emails in this thread dated back 8 months, but they referenced previous conversations and our usual arrangement, suggesting the relationship had been developing even longer than that. But it was the email thread from 2 months ago that made me understand this wasn't just about infidelity. It was about something much more dangerous. The Peterson contract numbers don't add up, Jessica had written. I ran the analysis 3 times, and there's no way we can deliver what we've promised at the price point we've committed to. The materials cost alone exceed our projected budget by 40%. David's response was casual and dismissive. Don't worry about the Peterson numbers. I've got alternate funding sources that will cover any overruns. Just make sure the client presentation looks solid. We'll figure out the details after we sign. My forensic accounting background immediately recognized the red flags in that exchange. Alternate funding sources that weren't reflected in the official project analysis suggested David was either hiding assets or planning to use funds allocated for other projects, both of which could constitute fraud depending on the specific circumstances. I continued reading my professional training, overriding my personal shock as I documented what I was discovering. Jessica Martinez wasn't just David's girlfriend. She was also Morrison Development's new financial analyst, the position I'd been systematically excluded from as David streamlined our operations. And based on the email evidence, she was either complicit in or being used to facilitate financial irregularities that could destroy everything we'd built together. The shower was still running upstairs, giving me precious time to gather information before David discovered what I'd found. I forwarded the most damaging email threads to my personal account, then cleared the browser history and closed the laptop, returning it to exactly the position where David had left it. When David came downstairs 20 minutes later, hair still damp from his shower and wearing the casual confidence of a man who believed his secrets were safe, I was setting the table for dinner as if nothing had changed. "Smells great in here," he said, kissing my cheek with lips that had probably been kissing Jessica Martinez just hours earlier. "What are we having? Your favorite," I replied, my voice steady and warm, despite the rage building in my chest. "Grilled salmon with that lemon herb sauce you love." David smiled and moved his laptop to his home office, completely unaware that his wife had just discovered the affair that would ultimately expose a web of financial fraud that reached far beyond our marriage. As I watched him disappear into his office, probably to delete the incriminating emails he'd carelessly left open, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my FBI days: the cold, focused determination of a hunter who had just identified her prey. David Morrison had made a crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the quiet, supportive wife who handled his books and stayed in the background during business meetings. He'd forgotten that Sarah Chin Morrison wasn't just a compliant accountant who was grateful for his success. He'd forgotten that he was married to someone whose expertise in detecting financial crimes could destroy him completely. And tomorrow, I would begin the most important investigation of my career. That night, I lay awake beside my husband of 10 years, listening to his steady breathing and wondering how many other lies had shared our bed. David slept peacefully, one arm draped possessively across my waist, in a gesture that had once made me feel cherished, but now felt like a chain binding me to a life built on deception. The emails I discovered replayed in my mind, like evidence being presented in court. 8 months of correspondence between David and Jessica Martinez. 8 months of stolen afternoons and fabricated client meetings. 8 months of I love you messages sent while David came home to kiss me goodnight and ask about my day. But what haunted me more than the affair itself were those casual references to financial irregularities, the dismissive way David had told Jessica not to worry about budget discrepancies that would have triggered immediate investigation during my FBI days. In my professional experience, men who lied to their wives about affairs were often lying about much more serious matters. At 3 in the morning, I slipped out of bed and padded silently to my home office, the small room David had grudgingly allocated for my accounting work when we bought the brownstone. For years, this space had felt like a consolation prize, a corner where I could handle the mundane financial tasks, while David occupied the Grand Master office with its mahogany desk and floor-to-ceiling windows. Now it felt like a command center. I powered up my laptop and opened the encrypted files I hadn't accessed since leaving the FBI. My credentials might have expired, but my training remained sharp, and my understanding of financial crime patterns was as acute as ever. What I needed now was to approach this situation like the federal investigator I'd once been, rather than the betrayed wife I currently was. The first step was understanding the scope of potential criminal activity. I pulled up Morrison Development's financial records from the past 2 years, documents I'd prepared myself but hadn't analyzed with the suspicious eye of a federal investigator. Looking at our books through the lens of potential fraud rather than routine business management revealed patterns that should have alarmed me months ago. Our accounts receivable had grown significantly over the past 18 months, but not in ways that corresponded to completed projects. We were carrying large outstanding balances from clients who should have paid upon completion, yet David had never mentioned collection issues during our financial meetings. More troubling were the equipment purchases and subcontractor payments that didn't align with any projects in our active files. Morrison Development had apparently spent nearly $200,000 on construction materials and specialty contractors for work I couldn't identify from our project schedules. Either David was developing projects he hadn't disclosed to me, which would be unusual, given that I handled all our financial planning, or money was being diverted for purposes that had nothing to do with legitimate business operations. I cross-referenced our bank statements with the project files, looking for patterns that might explain the discrepancies. What I found made my stomach clench with a familiar mixture of excitement and dread, the same feeling I'd experienced when a complex FBI investigation suddenly clicked into focus. David had been systematically billing clients for materials and labor that were then diverted to other projects. The Peterson contract Jessica had questioned in her email was just one example of what appeared to be a sophisticated scheme to inflate project costs and redirect the excess funds. A client would contract Morrison Development to build a small office complex for $5 million. David would legitimately spend $3 million on actual construction, then bill an additional $2 million for premium materials and specialized labor that were never delivered to that client's project. Instead, those materials would be used on other projects, creating a web of cross-subsidization that inflated his profit margins while technically fulfilling the letter of each individual contract. It was brilliant in its complexity and devastating in its implications. David wasn't just cheating on our marriage, he was defrauding our clients, manipulating our books, and potentially exposing our company to criminal charges that could result in federal prosecution. By dawn, I had identified at least 12 contracts over the past 2 years that showed evidence of systematic overcharging. The total amount of fraudulent billing appeared to exceed $6 million, enough to trigger federal racketeering charges if the pattern could be proven in court. But understanding the scope of David's financial crimes was only the beginning of what I needed to investigate. The emails between David and Jessica suggested she was aware of at least some financial irregularities, but her level of complicity wasn't clear from the limited correspondence I'd accessed. Was Jessica Martinez an innocent employee who was being manipulated by my husband, or was she an active participant in financial fraud? Had David recruited her specifically for her accounting skills and willingness to overlook discrepancies, or had she discovered his crimes and chosen to remain silent in exchange for their affair? More importantly, how many other employees, subcontractors, or business partners were involved in or aware of David's fraudulent practices? Morrison Development now employed 43 people and maintained relationships with dozens of suppliers and subcontractors. The scope of potential criminal liability could extend far beyond David himself. I made coffee and sat in my kitchen as sunrise painted the windows gold, contemplating the magnitude of what I'd discovered and the impossible choices that lay ahead of me. The ethical path was clear. I should report David's crimes to federal authorities and cooperate fully with whatever investigation followed. My background with the FBI meant I understood exactly how these cases developed, and I could provide investigators with evidence and analysis that would significantly strengthen their prosecution. But reporting David would destroy everything we'd built together over the past 10 years. Morrison Development employed dozens of people who depended on their jobs to support their families. Our clients trusted us with major construction projects that represented their life savings or business dreams. A federal fraud investigation would shut down our operations immediately, leaving employees unemployed and clients facing project delays that could bankrupt smaller businesses. The personal consequences would be equally devastating. David would face decades in federal prison. Our assets would be frozen pending investigation, leaving me financially vulnerable despite my professional qualifications. The scandal would destroy both our reputations in Chicago's business community, making it difficult for either of us to rebuild our careers. And then there was the matter of Jessica Martinez. Reading those intimate emails between my husband and his young lover had awakened something primitive and fierce in my chest, a desire for justice that went beyond legal prosecution. David had betrayed our marriage, our business partnership, and the trust of every client who'd hired Morrison Development, believing they were working with an honest company. But Jessica had betrayed something equally important, the professional standards and ethical obligations that should govern anyone working in financial management. She knew the numbers didn't add up, and instead of investigating or reporting the discrepancies, she'd chosen to remain silent and complicit. As a former federal investigator, I understood that the most satisfying cases weren't just about catching criminals. They were about ensuring that justice addressed all aspects of the crime and all participants received consequences proportional to their actions. David deserved to face criminal charges for fraud and racketeering, but he also deserved to experience the humiliation of having his affair exposed, his professional reputation destroyed, and his carefully constructed image of success revealed as a facade built on stolen money and betrayed trust. Jessica deserved to face professional consequences for her complicity in financial fraud, but she also deserved to learn that sleeping with married men who steal from their clients wasn't a pathway to professional advancement. It was a pathway to criminal liability and career destruction. Sitting in my kitchen that morning drinking coffee while my husband slept upstairs in the bed we'd shared for 10 years, I made a decision that would have horrified my former FBI supervisors, but felt absolutely right to the woman who'd been publicly humiliated and privately betrayed. I wasn't going to report David's crimes to federal authorities. Not yet. Instead, I was going to conduct my own investigation, thorough, methodical, and completely covert. I would gather evidence not just of financial fraud, but of the full scope of David's deception. I would document every lie, every stolen dollar, every secret meeting with Jessica Martinez. And when I had assembled an airtight case that would destroy David professionally, financially, and personally, I would choose the time and method of his exposure to ensure maximum impact and public humiliation. David Morrison thought he'd married a compliant accountant who was grateful to handle his books and stay in the background during business meetings. He was about to discover that he'd actually married someone whose expertise in financial investigation could end his freedom, his career, and his reputation with surgical precision. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since leaving the FBI. David stirred upstairs, and I heard the familiar sounds of him beginning his morning routine shower, running closet doors, opening the confident movements of a man who believed his secrets were safe. I smiled and began planning breakfast, the same supportive wife routine I'd performed for 10 years. But everything had changed in the past 8 hours. David Morrison was about to become the target of the most thorough financial investigation of his life, conducted by someone who loved him enough to want to destroy him completely. And he would never see it coming. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's decision to exclude me from major business decisions, the same dismissiveness that had made me feel marginalized and undervalued, would now work in my favor. His arrogant assumption that I was just a numbers person who couldn't understand the complexity of his business operations meant he would never suspect that his quiet, supportive wife was systematically documenting every aspect of his criminal enterprise. "Good morning, sweetheart," David said, appearing in the kitchen, already dressed in his expensive suit, checking his phone for messages that probably included good morning texts from Jessica Martinez. "Good morning," I replied, setting his coffee cup on the counter, exactly how he liked it. "How did you sleep? Like a baby," he said, kissing my cheek with the casual affection of a man who had no idea his entire world was about to crumble. "What's on your schedule today?" "Just the usual," I said with a smile. "Reviewing financial reports, updating project budgets. Nothing too exciting." David nodded approvingly, clearly pleased that his wife would be occupied with mundane tasks, while he conducted whatever business, legitimate or otherwise, filled his day. "Perfect," he said, pocketing his phone and heading toward the door. "I'll probably be late tonight. Client dinner with the Henderson Group." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that I wondered how many other client dinners had actually been romantic evenings with Jessica Martinez. But I simply nodded and wished him a good day, playing the role of the trusting wife one last time. After David left, I stood at our kitchen window watching his BMW disappear down the street, carrying him toward whatever deception filled his schedule. In a few hours, he would probably text me some fabricated story about unexpected meetings or difficult clients, creating the cover story for another afternoon with his young lover. But while David was conducting his affair, I would be conducting something far more dangerous, a comprehensive investigation that would uncover every secret he'd hidden, every dollar he'd stolen, and every lie he'd told. By the time I finished, David Morrison would discover that the quiet, supportive wife he'd underestimated was actually the most dangerous adversary he'd ever faced. And unlike his other victims, I wouldn't just be seeking financial compensation. I would be seeking complete and total destruction. The hunt had begun. The morning after my discovery, I sat in my home office staring at financial documents that had once represented our shared dreams, but now looked like evidence in a federal crime. The familiar weight of investigative work settled over me like a well-worn coat. The methodical patience, the analytical detachment, the quiet thrill of piecing together a puzzle that would ultimately expose the truth. It had been 10 years since I'd conducted a serious financial investigation, but the skills that had made me one of the FBI's most effective forensic accountants hadn't atrophied. If anything, my decade of managing Morrison Development's legitimate finances had sharpened my ability to recognize when numbers told stories their creators never intended to reveal. I began with what every good financial investigator knows is the foundation of any case, following the money trail with absolute precision and infinite patience. My first task was establishing a secure digital workspace where I could analyze evidence without leaving traces that David might discover. Using techniques I'd learned during my FBI training, I created an encrypted partition on my laptop and installed analysis software that would allow me to examine financial records without altering the original files. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's decision to exclude me from major business decisions had actually given me unrestricted access to our financial systems. As the company's official bookkeeper, I had legitimate reasons to access every account review, every transaction, and examine every contract in Morrison Development's files. What David didn't realize was that his numbers person wasn't just reviewing routine financial reports. She was conducting a federal-level forensic investigation into every aspect of his business operations. I started with our banking records using pattern recognition techniques to identify irregular transactions. Federal investigators call this looking for the holes in Swiss cheese, finding the empty spaces that reveal where money should be but isn't, or where money appears without logical explanation. Within 2 hours, I had identified 17 separate instances over the past 18 months where Morrison Development had received payments that didn't correspond to any contracts in our official files. These weren't small discrepancies. The amounts ranged from $15,000 to $67,000, totaling nearly $400,000 in unexplained income. Cross-referencing these mystery payments with our expense records revealed an even more troubling pattern. David had been using these undocumented funds to pay for materials, equipment, and subcontractor services that were then allocated to other projects, creating a complex web of financial manipulation that inflated our profit margins while defrauding legitimate clients. But understanding the mechanics of David's fraud was only the beginning. What I needed now was evidence of intent, proof that these weren't accounting errors or misunderstandings, but deliberate criminal activities that David had planned and executed over an extended period. That's when I remembered something from my FBI days that would prove invaluable in this investigation. Criminals who commit sophisticated financial fraud almost always maintain detailed records of their activities, not because they want to document their crimes, but because successful fraud requires careful tracking to avoid detection. David was organized and detail-oriented in every aspect of his life. If he was running a systematic fraud operation, he would need to keep records of which funds came from which sources, which materials were diverted to which projects, and which clients were being overcharged by how much. The question was where those records were hidden. I spent the next 3 days conducting what the FBI calls a soft search of our home and David's office, looking for evidence without disturbing anything in ways that might alert the target to ongoing investigation. This required the kind of patience and systematic approach that had made me successful during my federal career. I began with David's home office, using moments when he was in the shower or taking phone calls to examine his filing systems. Most of the documents were routine business records that I'd seen before, but I was looking for anything that might indicate he was maintaining parallel financial systems. The breakthrough came when I noticed that David's expensive filing cabinet had a false bottom, a modification so subtle that I almost missed it. Hidden beneath the lowest drawer was a thin compartment containing a tablet computer I'd never seen before. My hands trembled slightly as I powered up the device, not from nervousness, but from the anticipation of a hunter who'd just found the trail she'd been seeking. The tablet was password protected, but I knew David well enough to make educated guesses about his security choices. After 3 attempts, I gained access using a combination of his birthday and our wedding anniversary, the kind of personally significant password that security experts warn against, but that people use because they're easy to remember. What I found on that tablet would have been sufficient evidence for federal prosecutors to secure convictions on multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. David had meticulously documented every aspect of his criminal operation over the past 2 years. There were spreadsheets tracking which clients had been overcharged, detailed records of materials that had been diverted between projects, and calculations showing how much profit he generated through fraudulent billing practices. But most damaging of all were the communications between David and various subcontractors, suppliers, and business associates who were clearly aware they were participating in fraudulent activities. Per our discussion, I'm billing the Peterson project for premium steel at $4,200 per ton, but delivering standard grade at $2,800. Read one email from a materials supplier. The difference will be credited to your Riverside account as usual. Another email from a subcontractor who specialized in electrical work was even more explicit. Happy to inflate the Henderson invoices by 35% as long as you guarantee me the McKinney project next month. These fake billing arrangements work for everyone. David wasn't just committing fraud, he was running a criminal conspiracy that involved dozens of suppliers and contractors who were actively participating in systematic client deception. As I scrolled through months of incriminating evidence, I felt the familiar mixture of professional satisfaction and moral outrage that had driven my FBI career. David had built his success by stealing from clients who trusted him with their dreams and life savings. He'd corrupted suppliers and contractors who should have been honest business partners, and he'd used the profits from these crimes to fund an affair with a woman young enough to be his daughter. But the personal betrayal was only part of what I discovered on David's hidden tablet. The communications between David and Jessica Martinez revealed that their relationship was far more than a simple affair between a boss and his employee. Jessica wasn't just complicit in David's financial crimes, she was an active co-conspirator who had helped design and implement some of the most sophisticated aspects of his fraud operation. I've reviewed the Morrison contract, and I think we can inflate the environmental compliance costs by at least 20%, Jessica had written in an email dated 6 months earlier. The client won't have enough technical expertise to question specialized environmental engineering charges, and we can use standard materials while billing for premium eco-friendly alternatives. David's response showed how their professional and personal relationships had become intertwined. You're brilliant, beautiful, and devious. No wonder I can't get enough of you. Let's celebrate your Morrison idea tonight at our usual place. Reading their correspondence, I realized that Jessica Martinez wasn't an innocent young woman who'd been seduced by my husband's wealth and position. She was an ambitious criminal who'd identified David as a valuable partner in both business fraud and personal advancement. The timeline of their relationship documented in their emails and text messages showed that Jessica had approached David with suggestions for maximizing profit margins within weeks of being hired. Their affair had developed as a natural extension of their criminal partnership with stolen money funding, romantic dinners, and expensive gifts that strengthened their personal bond while deepening their professional complicity. But what made Jessica particularly dangerous was her sophisticated understanding of financial systems and regulatory compliance. Unlike David, whose fraud schemes were sometimes crude and obvious, Jessica brought technical expertise that made their crimes much harder to detect. She'd identified weaknesses in environmental compliance reporting that allowed Morrison Development to bill clients for expensive, eco-friendly materials while delivering standard alternatives. She'd developed invoice formatting systems that made fraudulent charges appear legitimate to clients who weren't sophisticated enough to recognize the deception. Most troubling of all, Jessica had been researching international banking systems and offshore account management, suggesting that she and David were planning to move their criminal proceeds beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. By the end of my first week of investigation, I had documented evidence of fraud totaling more than $800,000, involving at least 30 separate contracts and dozens of co-conspirators. David and Jessica weren't just cheating spouses, they were the leaders of a criminal organization that had systematically defrauded clients across the Chicago metropolitan area. But understanding the scope of their crimes was only the first phase of my investigation. What I needed now was evidence that would allow me to destroy them completely, not just through criminal prosecution, but through public exposure that would ensure they never again had the opportunity to victimize innocent people. During my FBI career, I'd learned that the most satisfying cases weren't just about putting criminals in prison, they were about ensuring that justice addressed every aspect of their wrongdoing and that their victims received both legal redress and emotional satisfaction. David Morrison deserved to face criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy, but he also deserved to experience the humiliation of having his affair exposed, his professional reputation destroyed, and his carefully constructed image revealed as a facade built on stolen money and betrayed trust. Jessica Martinez deserved to face professional consequences for her complicity in financial fraud. But she also deserved to learn that seducing married men and conspiring to steal from their clients wasn't a pathway to success, it was a pathway to criminal liability and social disgrace. Most importantly, the suppliers, contractors, and business associates who had chosen to participate in David's criminal schemes deserved to face consequences that would deter others from similar choices in the future. What I was planning wasn't just an investigation, it was a comprehensive campaign of strategic destruction that would ensure David's crimes were exposed in ways that maximized both legal consequences and public humiliation. But executing such a campaign would require more than just evidence gathering. It would require psychological preparation, strategic planning, and perfect timing to ensure that David and Jessica's exposure achieved maximum impact while protecting me from potential retaliation. As I sat in my home office that evening, surrounded by printed evidence of my husband's crimes and betrayals, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my FBI days. The cold, focused determination of a federal investigator who had identified her targets and was prepared to pursue them with unlimited patience and ruthless precision. David Morrison thought he'd married a compliant accountant who was grateful to handle routine financial tasks while he made the important decisions about their business and personal life. He was about to discover that he'd actually married someone whose expertise in financial investigation could destroy everything he'd built through a decade of lies, theft, and betrayal. The hunt was no longer just beginning, it was moving into its most dangerous phase. 3 weeks into my investigation, I made a discovery that transformed my understanding of David's criminal operation from significant fraud to something approaching organized crime. I was reviewing Morrison Development's tax filings from the previous 3 years, looking for discrepancies between our reported income and the actual revenue I'd documented through bank records when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The tax returns had been prepared and filed by Morrison and Associates, David's family accounting firm run by his older brother Thomas and his father Robert Morrison. For 10 years, I'd assumed David used his family's firm for our tax preparation as a matter of convenience and family loyalty. Now I realized it might be evidence of a criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond David and Jessica's fraud operation. The Morrison family had been in business for 40 years, building a reputation as one of Chicago's most respected accounting firms. They prepared tax returns for dozens of construction companies, real estate developers, and commercial contractors throughout the metropolitan area. If David's father and brother were helping him hide fraudulent income through manipulated tax filings, the implications were staggering. They wouldn't just be enabling David's crimes, they would be using their professional position to facilitate fraud that could involve dozens of other clients. But proving family complicity would require access to Morrison and Associates' internal files, something I couldn't obtain through my role at Morrison Development. What I needed was an insider who could help me understand how deeply the Morrison family's corruption extended. The answer came from an unexpected source, Margaret Chin, the wife of David's biggest investor and someone I'd considered a casual friend for several years. Margaret was a retired IRS investigator who'd spent 30 years tracking down tax fraud and business crimes before moving to Chicago with her husband's investment firm. I'd known about Margaret's professional background, but had never discussed it in detail, partly because David discouraged me from developing close friendships with the wives of his business associates. "It's better to maintain professional distance," he'd said. "Personal relationships can complicate business decisions." Now I understood that David's preference for keeping me isolated from other women with professional expertise might have been motivated by more than social considerations. Margaret Chin's investigative background would have made her a dangerous friend for the wife of someone committing systematic tax fraud. But Margaret's expertise was exactly what I needed to expand my investigation beyond David's hidden tablet and into the broader implications of Morrison family corruption. I approached Margaret carefully, using a casual lunch invitation to test whether she might be willing to share her professional insights about tax fraud patterns she'd encountered during her IRS career. "I'm helping David review some of our business relationships," I explained as we sat in a quiet restaurant far from Morrison Development's usual lunch spots. "There are some financial patterns in our industry that seem unusual, and I'd appreciate your perspective on whether they might indicate problems I should be concerned about." Margaret's expression sharpened with professional interest. "What kind of patterns?" I'd prepared carefully for this conversation, selecting examples that would demonstrate the scope of potential fraud without explicitly accusing David or his family of criminal activity. "Subcontractors who submit invoices that seem significantly higher than market rates for the work they're providing," I said. "Suppliers who offer substantial discounts for cash payments that aren't reflected in their official billing. Construction companies that report unusually low profit margins despite consistently winning competitive bids." Margaret set down her coffee cup and looked at me with the focused attention of an investigator who just heard something significant. "Sarah, those are classic indicators of systematic fraud," she said quietly. "Invoice inflation, cash kickback schemes, and artificial profit margin manipulation are among the most common methods contractors use to hide income from tax authorities." She paused, studying my expression carefully. "Are these patterns you're seeing in David's business relationships?" I nodded, maintaining the pretense that I was a concerned wife seeking advice rather than an experienced investigator gathering intelligence. "I don't want to believe David would be involved in anything improper," I said. "But some of the financial relationships seem questionable, and I'm not sure whether I should be worried." Margaret's response was immediate and unambiguous. "You should be very worried. If Morrison Development is connected to systematic fraud involving multiple contractors and suppliers, David could be facing serious criminal liability. And if his family's accounting firm is preparing tax returns that hide fraudulent income, the scope of potential prosecution could be enormous. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to the confidential tone I remembered from my own law enforcement days. "Sarah, I need to ask you something directly, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you have reason to believe that David is actively participating in tax fraud or money laundering?" The question hung between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or walk away from. Margaret's professional experience and investigative instincts had brought her to the same conclusions I'd reached through my own analysis, but admitting what I'd discovered would mean acknowledging that my marriage was built on criminal activity. More importantly, it would mean trusting Margaret with information that could destroy David, his family, and Morrison Development if it reached the wrong people at the wrong time. But looking into Margaret's eyes, I saw something that convinced me to take the risk, the moral certainty of someone who'd spent her career fighting financial crime and who understood that justice sometimes required difficult choices from unexpected allies. "Yes," I said simply, "I have evidence that David has been defrauding clients for at least 2 years, possibly longer. And I have reason to believe his family's accounting firm may be helping him hide the proceeds through manipulated tax filings." Margaret's expression didn't change, but I saw her shoulders straighten with the posture of an investigator who'd just been presented with a significant case. "How much evidence?" she asked. "Enough to secure federal convictions on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering," I replied. "David has been keeping detailed records of his criminal activities, apparently without realizing how damaging they would be if discovered by someone with investigative experience." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of what I told her. "Sarah, I need you to understand something," she said finally. "If David is running the kind of operation you're describing, and if his family is helping him hide the proceeds, this isn't just about your marriage or even your business. This is about a criminal organization that's probably stealing millions of dollars from clients across the construction industry." She paused, her expression serious. "The question is what you plan to do with the evidence you've gathered." It was the same question I'd been wrestling with for weeks, and Margaret's direct approach forced me to articulate the strategy that had been forming in my mind since discovering David's hidden tablet. "I want to destroy them completely," I said, surprising myself with how coldly I could state my intentions. Not just David and his affair with Jessica Martinez, but the entire criminal operation that's been stealing from clients and corrupting suppliers throughout Chicago. Margaret nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right approach. Men like David Morrison don't respond to warnings or second chances, they respond to complete exposure and total consequences." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "This is Special Agent Patricia Williams with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. She's handled dozens of construction industry fraud cases, and she'd be very interested in reviewing whatever evidence you've compiled." I stared at the card, feeling a mixture of excitement and terror at the prospect of involving federal law enforcement in my investigation. "I'm not ready to contact the FBI yet," I said carefully. "I want to gather more evidence about the scope of Morrison family involvement before I trigger an official investigation that could warn David and give him time to destroy records or flee." Margaret's smile was knowing and slightly predatory. "You're thinking like an investigator rather than a victim. That's good. It means you understand that timing is everything in cases like this." She leaned back in her chair, clearly shifting into consultation mode. "What's your timeline? How long do you think you need to document the full scope of their criminal operation?" I'd been thinking about this question for days, balancing my desire for thoroughness against the risk that David might discover my investigation and take steps to protect himself. 6 weeks," I said. I need time to access Morrison and Associates files, document the money laundering operation, and identify all the co-conspirators who've been participating in the fraud scheme. Margaret nodded. 6 weeks should be sufficient if you're systematic about evidence gathering, but you'll need to be extremely careful about operational security. David can't have any indication that you're investigating his activities. She was right, of course. The success of my investigation depended entirely on maintaining the illusion that I was still the quiet, supportive wife who handled routine accounting tasks, while David made the important decisions about our business. But as our conversation continued, I realized that Margaret was offering more than just professional advice. She was offering to become an active partner in my investigation. "I'd like to help you," she said as we prepared to leave the restaurant. "I have contacts in law enforcement experience with financial crime investigation, and most importantly, I understand how satisfying it can be to take down criminals who think they're too smart to get caught." Her offer was tempting and potentially invaluable, but it also represented a significant escalation in the scope and risk of my investigation. "What kind of help?" I asked. "Intelligence gathering, evidence analysis, strategic planning for maximum impact when you're ready to expose them," Margaret replied. "I can help you access information you couldn't obtain on your own, and I can ensure that when you're ready to move against David and his family, the exposure achieves maximum legal and professional consequences." I looked at this woman who'd spent 30 years fighting financial crime and who was offering to help me destroy the criminal organization that had been operating under the cover of my marriage. "Why?" I asked. "Why would you risk your reputation and possibly your safety to help me expose David's crimes?" Margaret's answer was immediate and heartfelt. "Because I've spent my entire career watching men like David Morrison steal from innocent people while hiding behind respectability and family connections. Because I've seen too many victims who never got justice because criminals were too smart or too well connected to face consequences." She paused, her expression becoming more personal. "And because you remind me of myself 30 years ago, intelligent, capable, and surrounded by people who underestimate what you're capable of achieving when properly motivated." That afternoon, I gained something I hadn't expected when I began investigating David's crimes: a partner whose expertise complemented my own and whose commitment to justice matched the cold determination that had been building in my chest for weeks. Margaret Chin and I began meeting twice weekly to plan what we called Operation Morrison. Behind closed doors, a comprehensive investigation designed to expose and destroy the criminal organization that David had built, while maintaining the facade of a successful marriage and legitimate business. But even with Margaret's help, I knew that the most dangerous phase of our investigation was still ahead. Documenting David's crimes was only the beginning. What mattered now was planning his exposure in ways that would ensure maximum impact, while protecting both Margaret and myself from potential retaliation. David Morrison thought he'd married a compliant accountant who was grateful to support his success from the background. He was about to discover that he'd actually married someone who could orchestrate his complete destruction with the precision of a federal investigation and the ruthlessness of a woman who'd been betrayed by everything she'd believed about her life. 6 weeks before the Morrison Development Anniversary Gala, Margaret Chin and I sat in my home office, reviewing what had become the most comprehensive white-collar crime investigation either of us had ever assembled. The evidence spread across my desk represented more than 2 years of systematic criminal activity involving dozens of co-conspirators and nearly $3 million in fraudulent billing. But documentation was only half of what we'd accomplished during our partnership. The other half was strategic planning for an exposure operation that would ensure David, Jessica, and the Morrison family faced consequences proportional to the scope of their crimes. The key to maximum impact, Margaret explained as we reviewed our timeline, is simultaneous destruction of their professional reputations, personal relationships, and legal standing. Criminal prosecution alone isn't sufficient. We need public exposure that ensures they never again have the opportunity to victimize innocent people. She was right, of course. During my FBI career, I'd seen too many white-collar criminals who served brief prison sentences and then resumed their careers with minimal long-term consequences. What David and his co-conspirators deserved was complete social and professional destruction that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. The Morrison Development Anniversary Gala would provide the perfect venue for David's exposure, with 200 of Chicago's most influential business leaders gathered to celebrate what they believed was a legitimate success story. The guest list included clients who'd been defrauded suppliers, who'd participated in the fraud investors, who'd been deceived about the company's true financial condition, and media representatives who could ensure the scandal received maximum publicity. Most importantly, the anniversary celebration would give us a captive audience of people who had professional and financial relationships with Morrison Development people who would spread the news of David's crimes throughout Chicago's business community within hours of his exposure. But orchestrating David's public destruction required more than just choosing the right venue. We needed to ensure that the evidence was presented in ways that would maximize shock value while providing sufficient detail to demonstrate the scope of his criminal operation. Margaret's experience with federal investigations proved invaluable in designing what she called our presentation strategy. The audience needs to understand immediately that this isn't just about marital infidelity, she explained. They need to see that David has been stealing from clients, corrupting suppliers, and using his family's accounting firm to hide millions of dollars in fraudulent proceeds. We spent weeks developing a multimedia presentation that would walk the anniversary gala audience through David's crimes with the same precision and clarity I'd once used in federal court. The presentation included financial documents, email correspondence, bank records, and recordings of phone conversations that Margaret had helped me obtain through her law enforcement contacts. But the most damaging evidence would be the testimony of David's co-conspirators themselves. Using Margaret's contacts in federal law enforcement, we'd identified 3 suppliers and 2 subcontractors who were willing to provide evidence about David's fraud operation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Their recorded statements provided detailed descriptions of how David had recruited them into his criminal schemes and threatened them with loss of business if they refused to participate. Morrison told me that overcharging clients was standard practice in the construction industry, explained Robert Martinez, an electrical contractor who'd been inflating invoices for Morrison Development for 18 months. He said everyone did it, and that contractors who refused to play along would be shut out of the best projects. Another co-conspirator, Linda Washington, who supplied premium building materials that were never actually delivered to client projects, described how David had gradually increased the scope of fraudulent billing over time. It started small, maybe 5 or 10% overcharges that Morrison said were for project management fees, she explained in her recorded statement. But over the past year, he's been demanding that we inflate invoices by 30 or 40%, with the excess going directly into accounts that he and his girlfriend control. These recorded statements would provide devastating testimony about David's criminal operation, but they would also serve another strategic purpose, demonstrating to the anniversary gala audience that Morrison Development's apparent success was built entirely on stolen money. Every major project David had completed over the past 2 years had involved systematic fraud that inflated costs and compromised quality while enriching David and Jessica at their clients' expense. But beyond gathering evidence and planning David's public exposure, I realized that I needed to prepare myself psychologically for the confrontation that would end my marriage and probably destroy everything we'd built together over the past 10 years. The woman who discovered David's affair 3 months earlier had been devastated by the betrayal of someone she'd loved and trusted. The woman who would expose his crimes at the anniversary gala would need to be someone entirely different, someone capable of destroying David without hesitation or remorse. That transformation required what I privately called emotional conditioning, a process of systematically replacing my feelings of love and loyalty with the cold determination necessary to execute David's complete destruction. I began by reviewing the evidence of David's crimes every morning, forcing myself to confront the scope of his deception and the harm he'd caused to innocent victims. The elderly couple who'd lost their retirement savings when David's environmental compliance fraud forced them to rebuild their home. The small business owner who'd been charged 40% more than necessary for office construction that used substandard materials. The nonprofit organization that had been forced to cancel community programs because David's inflated billing had exceeded their construction budget. Each victim represented someone who trusted Morrison Development with their dreams and financial security, only to be betrayed by David's greed and criminal ambition. But the evidence that proved most effective in hardening my resolve was the correspondence between David and Jessica that documented how they'd laughed about deceiving their clients and stealing from people who trusted them. Mrs. Peterson called again today, asking about the premium environmental materials we're supposedly installing. Jessica had written in an email to David. I told her they were being delivered next week, but obviously we're using standard materials and pocketing the $20,000 difference. She's so trusting, it's almost pathetic. David's response revealed the casual cruelty that I now realize characterized his approach to both business and personal relationships. The Petersons are exactly the kind of clients I love, too naive to question our expertise and too grateful for our attention to investigate the details. Keep feeding them technical explanations they won't understand and make sure they feel lucky to be working with Morrison Development. Reading exchanges like this, I realized that the man I'd loved for 10 years had never actually existed. The David Morrison I'd married had been a carefully constructed performance designed to secure my loyalty and professional expertise, while he built a criminal empire that betrayed every value I believed we shared. The real David Morrison was someone who stole from elderly couples, laughed about deceiving nonprofit organizations, and viewed his clients as opportunities for exploitation rather than people deserving honest service. Understanding this truth didn't eliminate the pain of betrayal, but it replaced that pain with something more useful, a desire for justice that felt pure and righteous rather than merely personal. By the time Margaret and I finalized our exposure strategy, I no longer felt like a betrayed wife seeking revenge against an unfaithful husband. I felt like a federal investigator preparing to take down a criminal organization that had spent years victimizing innocent people while hiding behind respectability and community connections. The final phase of our preparation involved what Margaret called operational security, ensuring that David had no warning about what would happen at the anniversary gala. This required me to maintain the performance of being a supportive wife while secretly coordinating with federal agents, preparing multimedia evidence presentations, and arranging for the arrest warrants that would be executed immediately after David's public exposure. The psychological challenge of this deception was enormous. I had to smile and kiss David goodbye each morning while knowing that I was actively working to destroy him. I had to discuss anniversary gala planning with him while secretly coordinating with Margaret to ensure the event would become the vehicle for his complete professional and personal destruction. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of maintaining my cover was managing David's increasing confidence and affection as the anniversary date approached. I keep thinking about how far we've come, he said one evening as we reviewed the guest list for the anniversary gala. 10 years ago, Morrison Development was just a small construction company with big dreams. Now we're one of the most respected firms in Chicago, and it's largely because of your support and expertise. He pulled me close and kissed my forehead with what seemed like genuine tenderness. I know I don't say this often enough, but you've been the foundation of everything we've built together. I couldn't have achieved any of this success without you. The irony of his words was staggering. David was crediting me with helping him build the success that I was about to reveal as a criminal enterprise funded by systematic fraud. He was expressing gratitude for my support while remaining completely unaware that I was orchestrating his destruction with the same analytical precision I'd once brought to FBI investigations. But his affectionate words also reminded me of something important. David's crimes weren't just about stealing money from clients. They were about betraying the trust of everyone who'd believed in Morrison Development's integrity, including employees who'd built their careers with our company and suppliers who'd maintained honest business relationships with us for years. When David's criminal operation was exposed, dozens of innocent people would face professional and financial consequences through no fault of their own. Our employees would lose their jobs, our honest suppliers would lose a major client, and our legitimate contractors would be associated with a company that had become synonymous with fraud and corruption. This realization added another dimension to the justice I was seeking. It wasn't enough to destroy David and Jessica. I needed to ensure that their exposure protected innocent people from further victimization, while providing clear evidence that Morrison Development's crimes were the result of leadership decisions, rather than company-wide corruption. Margaret helped me design a presentation strategy that would achieve this goal by clearly distinguishing between David's criminal leadership and the legitimate work performed by Morrison Development's employees and honest business partners. The audience needs to understand that David and Jessica corrupted an otherwise legitimate business operation, she explained. That distinction will protect innocent employees and suppliers while ensuring that all criminal liability falls on the people who actually committed the crimes. 2 weeks before the anniversary gala, I received a phone call that confirmed everything Margaret and I had suspected about the scope of Morrison family criminal activity. Special Agent Patricia Williams from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division had completed her preliminary investigation of Morrison and Associates' tax preparation practices, and the results were even more damaging than we'd anticipated. Mrs. Morrison, Agent Williams said during our confidential phone call, the evidence you and Mrs. Chen have provided has enabled us to identify a pattern of systematic tax fraud involving at least 40 construction companies and real estate developers throughout the Chicago metropolitan area. She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. David's father and brother haven't just been helping him hide fraudulent income, they've been operating a criminal organization that's facilitated tax evasion and money laundering for dozens of clients over the past 5 years. The scope of Morrison family criminality was breathtaking. Robert and Thomas Morrison had been using their accounting firm's reputation and client relationships to enable systematic fraud throughout Chicago's construction industry, generating millions of dollars in hidden income while helping their clients evade federal and state tax obligations. We're prepared to execute arrest warrants for all 3 Morrison men immediately following David's public exposure, Agent Williams continued. The simultaneous arrests will prevent them from coordinating their legal defense or destroying evidence that might implicate other co-conspirators. That phone call marked the final confirmation that my investigation had uncovered exactly what I'd suspected since discovering David's hidden tablet, a criminal organization that extended far beyond my husband's affair and business fraud into a web of corruption that had victimized hundreds of clients and defrauded government agencies of millions in tax revenue. But it also meant that the anniversary gala would result in consequences far beyond David's public humiliation. When I walked onto that stage to expose his crimes, I would be triggering a federal law enforcement operation that would destroy not just David and Jessica, but the entire Morrison family business empire that had been built on 40 years of apparent respectability. Standing in my home office that final evening before the anniversary gala, surrounded by evidence of crimes that would send David to federal prison for decades, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my FBI days, the profound satisfaction of an investigator who'd successfully identified, tracked, and trapped her target. David Morrison had spent 10 years underestimating the quiet, supportive wife who handled his financial records and stayed in the background during business meetings. Tomorrow night, he would discover that he'd actually married someone whose expertise in financial investigation could destroy everything he'd built through years of crime, deception, and arrogance. The hunt was over. The execution was about to begin. The crystal chandelier in the Fairmont Hotel's grand ballroom cast the same dancing shadows I'd watched 3 months earlier when David first announced his intention to divorce me for Jessica Martinez. Tonight, however, the 200 guests who'd gathered to celebrate Morrison Development's 10th anniversary had no idea they were about to witness the complete destruction of everything they believed about Chicago's most successful real estate development company. I stood at the back of the ballroom wearing the navy blue dress David had helped me select because he said it made me look appropriately professional for company events. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd chosen to wear the same outfit for his destruction that I'd worn for my public humiliation 3 months earlier. But everything else had changed since that terrible night when David had introduced Jessica as his future and dismissed me as a valuable asset who'd served her purpose. The quiet, supportive wife who'd stood frozen with shock while her husband replaced her with a younger model had been transformed into someone far more dangerous, a federal investigator with enough evidence to destroy not just David's marriage, but his freedom, his family's business empire, and his carefully constructed reputation. The evening began exactly as David had planned it, a celebration of Morrison Development's success that would position him as one of Chicago's most visionary business leaders, while introducing Jessica Martinez as his new executive partner in both professional and personal capacities. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said, his voice carrying easily across the crowded ballroom as he stood on the raised platform where a podium had been positioned for the evening's presentations. 10 years ago, Morrison Development was just a dream shared by two people who believed we could build something special in Chicago's competitive real estate market. He gestured toward me with the practiced charm that had once made me feel cherished, but now struck me as calculated performance. Sarah and I started this company with nothing but ambition, integrity, and a commitment to delivering honest value to our clients. The applause was warm and genuine, filled with appreciation from clients who believed they'd received exactly the honest value David claimed to provide. If they only knew, I thought watching the faces of people who'd been systematically defrauded for years while trusting Morrison Development with their most important construction projects. David continued his presentation with the confident ease of someone who believed his secrets were safe and his future secure. He highlighted Morrison Development's most impressive projects, shared statistics about our growth and profitability, and painted a picture of continued expansion that would establish our company as Chicago's premier development firm. But success isn't just about buildings and profits. David said, his tone becoming more personal as he approached the moment I'd been anticipating for weeks. It's about partnerships that inspire us to achieve more than we ever thought possible. He paused, scanning the audience with the dramatic timing of someone accustomed to commanding attention. 3 months ago, I announced some personal changes that allowed me to pursue both professional opportunities and personal happiness that had been constrained by previous arrangements. The euphemistic language was typical David, framing his affair and abandonment of our marriage as personal changes and constrained arrangements, rather than acknowledging the betrayal and deception that had actually characterized his behavior. Tonight, I'm proud to introduce someone who represents everything Morrison Development will become in the next decade. David continued, his voice warming with genuine affection as he gestured toward the side of the stage. Ms. Jessica Martinez brings innovative perspectives, analytical expertise, and strategic vision that will guide our company's expansion into new markets and opportunities. Jessica emerged from behind the velvet curtains wearing a stunning red dress that probably cost more than most of our employees' monthly salaries. She moved with practiced confidence toward David, accepting his outstretched hand and allowing him to pull her close to his side in a gesture of proprietary intimacy. The audience applauded politely, though I noticed some uncomfortable shifting among guests who remembered David's public humiliation of me 3 months earlier. Margaret Chin, seated at a table near the front of the room, caught my eye and nodded slightly, our prearranged signal that she was ready to execute the technical aspects of our exposure plan. Jessica has already contributed significantly to Morrison Development's success. David continued, his hand resting possessively on Jessica's lower back. Her analytical insights have identified new revenue opportunities, streamlined our operational efficiency, and positioned us for expansion that will double our business within 5 years. What David didn't know was that Jessica's analytical insights had primarily involved developing increasingly sophisticated methods for defrauding clients while hiding the proceeds through complex financial arrangements that would soon trigger federal criminal charges. In fact, David said, his confidence reaching levels that would have been amusing if they weren't so tragic. Jessica's innovations have been so successful that I've decided to formalize her role as Executive Vice President of Strategic Development, effective immediately. The announcement drew surprised murmurs from the audience. Several guests looked confused, clearly wondering why David was making major corporate announcements at what was supposed to be a celebration of past achievements, rather than a business meeting. But David was far from finished with his presentation. "I've also asked Jessica to become my wife," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom like a challenge thrown at the feet of anyone who might question his personal choices. "She's agreed to marry me, and we'll be honoring our commitment to each other and to Morrison Development's future at a ceremony this summer." The silence that followed was deafening. 200 people sat frozen in their chairs, processing the implications of what they'd just heard. David Morrison hadn't just replaced his wife with a younger model, he was promoting his mistress to executive leadership while announcing their engagement at a company anniversary celebration. The shock was visible on faces throughout the ballroom. Some guests looked appalled by David's arrogance, others seemed fascinated by the drama unfolding before them, and a few appeared genuinely confused about why David would choose such a public venue for personal announcements that had nothing to do with Morrison Development's business achievements. But David's expression showed nothing but satisfaction as he surveyed the audience's reaction. This was his moment of complete triumph. Professional success, personal happiness, and public validation of his right to discard anyone who no longer served his purposes. "I know some of you may have questions about these changes," David said, his tone taking on the patronizing quality I'd learned to recognize when he was dismissing concerns he considered irrelevant. "But I want to assure everyone that Morrison Development's commitment to excellence and integrity remains unchanged. Jessica and I will build on the foundation that's brought us this far while pursuing opportunities that will benefit all our clients, employees, and business partners." That was my cue. I began walking toward the front of the ballroom, my steps measured and deliberate as conversations erupted around me. David noticed my movement and smiled, apparently assuming I was coming forward to offer congratulations, or perhaps to demonstrate my acceptance of the new arrangements. Sarah, David said as I approached the platform, his voice warm with what seemed like genuine affection. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Your contributions to Morrison Development's early success deserve to be recognized, especially as we transition into this exciting new phase. He gestured for me to join him on the platform, clearly intending to position my presence as endorsement of his corporate and personal announcements. I climbed the steps to the platform and accepted the microphone David offered, looking out at the sea of faces that represented Chicago's most influential business community. These were people who'd trusted Morrison Development with millions of dollars in construction projects, people who'd believed they were working with an honest company, committed to delivering value and integrity. They deserved to know the truth about what Morrison Development had actually become under David's leadership. Thank you, David. I said, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom sound system. You're absolutely right that tonight is the perfect time to discuss Morrison Development's foundation and future direction. I paused, scanning the audience with the confidence of someone who'd spent years presenting evidence in federal courtrooms. In fact, I have a presentation that I think will help everyone understand exactly what Morrison Development has accomplished over the past 2 years and what our clients can expect from the company's leadership going forward. David's expression shifted from confident satisfaction to confused uncertainty. This wasn't part of the script he'd planned for the evening, but he couldn't object to my participation without appearing churlish in front of 200 influential guests. Of course, he said, though I caught the slight edge in his voice that suggested he was already regretting his decision to invite me onto the platform. I'm sure everyone would be interested in your perspective on our company's development. Margaret Chen had already activated the ballroom's multimedia presentation system, and the large screens positioned throughout the room came to life with the first slide of the presentation she and I had spent weeks preparing. Morrison Development's financial performance, a comprehensive analysis, appeared in bold letters across multiple screens, accompanied by Morrison Development's corporate logo and what appeared to be a standard business presentation format. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I'd once used when presenting evidence to federal juries. What you're about to see is the result of an extensive forensic accounting investigation into Morrison Development's business practices over the past 2 years. David's face went pale as the implications of my words began to register. Jessica stepped closer to him, her confident smile faltering as she realized that something was going very wrong with their evening of triumph. This investigation was conducted using Federal Bureau of Investigation forensic accounting protocols. I continued watching as shocked murmurs rippled through the audience. The evidence you're about to review has been compiled in cooperation with federal law enforcement agencies and will be used to support criminal prosecutions that are already in progress. The second slide appeared on the screens throughout the ballroom, showing a detailed financial analysis that documented systematic overcharging across dozens of Morrison Development projects. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Morrison Development had fraudulently billed clients for nearly $3 million over the past 2 years. What you're seeing, I explained as gasps and exclamations arose from the audience, is evidence that Morrison Development has been systematically defrauding its clients through inflated billing, substandard materials substitution, and false environmental compliance reporting. David finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper rather than his usual commanding tone. Sarah, what are you doing? This is some kind of mistake. I turned to face my husband, directly seeing in his eyes the dawning realization that his entire world was collapsing around him. The only mistake, David, was trusting that your criminal activities would remain hidden. I said, my voice carrying enough for the audience to hear every word. But then you've made quite a few mistakes over the past 2 years. The third slide appeared on the screens showing email correspondence between David and various suppliers, documenting their participation in fraudulent billing schemes. The audience fell completely silent as they read David's own words describing how to inflate invoices and hide the proceeds from client oversight. These communications, I explained, document Mr. Morrison's recruitment of suppliers and contractors into a criminal conspiracy designed to steal money from clients who trusted Morrison Development with their construction projects. Jessica finally spoke, her voice shaky but defiant. This is ridiculous. Sarah is obviously having some kind of breakdown because of the divorce. None of this is true. I smiled at Jessica with the cold satisfaction of a federal investigator who was about to destroy her target completely. Ms. Martinez, I said, I think you'll find your own communications particularly interesting. The fourth slide filled the screens with email exchanges between David and Jessica, documenting not just their affair, but their collaboration in developing increasingly sophisticated fraud schemes. The audience could read Jessica's own suggestions for overcharging clients and her calculations showing how much money they could steal from each project. As you can see, I continued, Ms. Martinez wasn't just Mr. Morrison's mistress, she was his partner in criminal activities that have defrauded dozens of clients represented in this room tonight. The ballroom erupted in shocked conversations as guests recognized their own projects in the financial documents being displayed. Clients who'd paid premium prices for environmental compliance that was never delivered. Investors who'd been charged for materials that were never purchased. Contractors who'd been pressured to participate in fraudulent billing or lose their access to Morrison Development projects. David tried to regain control of the situation, reaching for the microphone with desperate urgency. This is insane. Sarah is obviously trying to destroy our company because she's bitter about our divorce. None of these allegations are true. I pulled the microphone away from his grasp and continued my presentation with the relentless precision of a federal prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. The financial fraud documented here represents only part of Morrison Development's criminal activities. I said as the fifth slide appeared showing bank records for accounts that David and Jessica had hidden from corporate oversight. Mr. Morrison and Ms. Martinez have also been engaged in money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud federal agencies responsible for environmental compliance monitoring. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Bank records showing millions of dollars in hidden accounts, tax returns that had been falsified to hide fraudulent income, environmental compliance reports that had been fabricated to secure building permits for projects that didn't meet federal safety standards. But perhaps most importantly, I said, advancing to the final slide of my presentation, Morrison Development's criminal activities have been facilitated by Morrison and Associates, the accounting firm operated by Mr. Morrison's father and brother. And the last slide showed federal arrest warrants that had been issued for Robert Morrison, Thomas Morrison, David Morrison, and Jessica Martinez. The documents were dated that morning and would be executed immediately following my presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I concluded, what you've witnessed tonight is the complete exposure of a criminal organization that has been operating under the cover of Morrison Development's reputation for integrity and community service. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. 200 people sat in stunned shock, processing the revelation that one of Chicago's most respected development companies had been systematically stealing from its clients while corrupting suppliers and violating federal environmental laws. David stood beside me on the platform, his face ashen and his confident demeanor completely shattered. The man who'd begun the evening by announcing his professional triumph and personal happiness was now facing the destruction of everything he'd built through years of crime and deception. Jessica had backed away from both of us, clearly calculating whether she could escape from the ballroom before federal agents arrived to execute the arrest warrants I'd just displayed. But escape was no longer possible for either of them. The ballroom doors opened and FBI agents entered from multiple entrances, their movements coordinated and professional as they approached the platform where David, Jessica, and I stood, surrounded by the evidence of crimes that would send them to federal prison for decades. David Morrison. Special Agent Patricia Williams announced as she climbed the steps to the platform, "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and violation of federal environmental compliance laws." The aftermath of David's arrest unfolded with the systematic precision of a federal law enforcement operation that had been planned for weeks. As FBI agents led David and Jessica from the ballroom in handcuffs, their confident expressions replaced by shock and terror, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my days with the Bureau, the profound satisfaction of seeing justice served to criminals who'd believed they were too smart to get caught. The 200 guests who'd come to celebrate Morrison Development's success sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that they'd been witnessing the exposure of one of Chicago's most sophisticated white-collar criminal operations. Several clients approached me immediately, their faces showing mixtures of gratitude and anger as they realized how extensively they'd been defrauded. "Mrs. Morrison," said Elizabeth Peterson, the elderly woman whose retirement home construction had been inflated by over $40,000. "I don't know how to thank you for exposing what they did to us. We trusted them with our life savings." Her husband nodded emphatically. "If you hadn't found the courage to investigate and expose their crimes, they would have kept stealing from families like ours indefinitely." Similar conversations occurred throughout the ballroom as other victims realized the scope of Morrison Development's fraud and the personal risk I'd taken to document their crimes. These people understood that my investigation hadn't been motivated by personal revenge. It had been driven by a commitment to justice that protected innocent victims from continued exploitation. Margaret Chin appeared at my side as federal agents completed their arrests and began securing evidence from the ballroom's multimedia presentation system. "How do you feel?" she asked, her expression showing both professional satisfaction and personal concern for my emotional state. "Free," I replied, surprising myself with how accurately that single word captured what I was experiencing. "For the first time in years, I feel completely free." It was true. The weight of maintaining the performance of a supportive wife while secretly investigating David's crimes had been enormous. Now that the truth was exposed and justice was in motion, I felt lighter than I had since discovering David's hidden tablet 3 months earlier. But the immediate aftermath of David's arrest was only the beginning of consequences that would extend far beyond that single evening. Within 48 hours, federal agents had executed search warrants for Morrison Development's offices, Morrison and Associates accounting firm, and the homes of all 4 defendants. The evidence they seized confirmed everything Margaret and I had documented during our investigation, while revealing additional crimes that extended the scope of the conspiracy even further. Robert and Thomas Morrison had been facilitating tax fraud for more than 40 construction companies throughout the Chicago metropolitan area, generating millions of dollars in hidden income while helping their clients evade federal and state tax obligations. Their arrest triggered investigations into dozens of other businesses that had used Morrison and Associates services to hide fraudulent activities. David's criminal operation had been even more extensive than we'd realized. Federal investigators discovered that he'd been systematically overcharging clients for nearly 4 years, stealing more than $5 million through inflated billing, substandard materials substitution, and false environmental compliance reporting. Most shocking of all was the revelation that Jessica Martinez had been recruited specifically for her willingness to participate in criminal activities. She wasn't an innocent young woman who'd been seduced by David's wealth and position. She was an experienced fraudster who'd been fired from her previous job for embezzling client funds. David Morrison didn't just have an affair, Special Agent Williams explained during one of our post-arrest interviews. He recruited a criminal partner whose expertise in financial fraud made his operation much more sophisticated and harder to detect. The legal consequences for all four defendants were severe and swift. David pleaded guilty to 17 federal charges, including conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and violation of environmental compliance laws. His sentence of 22 years in federal prison ensured that he would spend the majority of his remaining productive years behind bars. Jessica received 15 years after cooperating with prosecutors and providing evidence about other criminal activities she'd participated in before joining Morrison Development. Her cooperation reduced her sentence, but didn't protect her from the complete destruction of her professional reputation and career prospects. Robert and Thomas Morrison each received 12-year sentences for their roles in facilitating tax fraud throughout Chicago's construction industry. The collapse of Morrison & Associates triggered investigations into dozens of other businesses and resulted in additional prosecutions that continued for years. But the legal consequences were only part of the justice that David and his co-conspirators faced. The scandal became front-page news throughout Chicago and attracted national attention as an example of how sophisticated white-collar criminals could hide behind respectable businesses while systematically victimizing innocent clients. David's arrest and conviction destroyed not just his freedom, but his reputation, his social standing, and any possibility of rebuilding his career after prison. Morrison Development's assets were liquidated to provide restitution for defrauded clients, with federal authorities recovering more than $4 million that was distributed among victims based on the scope of their individual losses. The Peterson family received full restitution for their inflated construction costs, along with additional compensation for the emotional distress caused by David's deception. Most satisfying of all was the impact David's exposure had on other potential white-collar criminals throughout Chicago's business community. The Morrison case became a cautionary tale about the risks of financial fraud, demonstrating that even sophisticated criminal operations could be detected and prosecuted by investigators with the right expertise and determination. For me personally, David's arrest and conviction marked the beginning of a transformation that I hadn't anticipated when I first discovered his hidden tablet. The FBI offered me a position as a senior financial crimes consultant, recognizing that my successful investigation of the Morrison conspiracy demonstrated expertise that would be valuable in other complex cases. After 10 years away from federal law enforcement, I found myself returning to work I'd always loved but had abandoned in favor of building a life with David. You've proven that you're one of the most effective financial investigators we've ever worked with, Special Agent Williams told me during my interview for the consultant position. The Morrison case showed a level of analytical sophistication and investigative patience that's rare even among experienced federal agents. I accepted the position with gratitude and excitement, recognizing that my experience with David's case had sharpened my investigative skills in ways that would benefit other victims of financial crime. But more importantly, I discovered that exposing David's crimes had restored something I'd lost during our marriage: confidence in my own judgment and capabilities. For years, David had systematically undermined my professional self-confidence while positioning himself as the visionary leader who made important decisions while I handled routine support functions. His condescending attitude and dismissive comments had gradually convinced me that my analytical skills were less valuable than his business instincts. Conducting the investigation that destroyed David's criminal operation proved that my expertise in financial analysis was not just valuable, it was powerful enough to bring down sophisticated criminal conspiracies that had fooled other investigators and business professionals. The woman who discovered David's affair 3 months earlier had been devastated by the betrayal of someone she'd loved and trusted. The woman who emerged from his arrest and conviction was someone entirely different, confident, independent, and absolutely certain of her own worth and capabilities. I sold the brownstone David and I had shared, using the proceeds to purchase a smaller but more elegant apartment that reflected my personal taste rather than our joint aesthetic preferences. I donated David's remaining possessions to charity, keeping only items that had personal significance unrelated to our marriage. Most importantly, I began building relationships with people who appreciated my intelligence and expertise rather than viewing me as a support function for their own ambitions. Margaret Chin became not just a professional colleague, but a close friend whose respect for my investigative abilities helped me recognize qualities in myself that David had spent years diminishing. Working with her during the Morrison investigation had shown me what true partnership looked like, two professionals combining their expertise to achieve goals that neither could accomplish alone. My new position with the FBI brought me into contact with other investigators, prosecutors, and victims advocates who valued analytical precision and moral courage over social connections or physical appearance. For the first time in years, I was surrounded by people who judged me based on my professional competence rather than my role as someone's wife. 1 year after David's arrest, I received a letter from Elizabeth Peterson, thanking me again for exposing the fraud that had nearly destroyed her family's financial security. "You gave us more than just our money back," she wrote. "You gave us faith that there are still people in the world who will fight for justice even when it requires personal sacrifice." Reading her letter, I realized that my investigation of David's crimes hadn't just served the cause of justice, it had revealed something important about my own character and capabilities. The quiet, supportive wife who'd handled David's financial records while staying in the background during business meetings had actually been one of the FBI's most effective financial investigators, temporarily suppressing her professional identity to build a marriage that turned out to be based on lies and criminal activity. Exposing David's crimes had required me to reclaim that professional identity and use it to protect innocent victims from continued exploitation. The process had been painful and dangerous, but it had also been transformative in ways that extended far beyond the specific case. I was no longer someone who defined herself through relationships with others or who measured her worth based on other people's approval. I was someone who could identify complex criminal conspiracies, gather evidence that would stand up in federal court, and execute exposure strategies that achieved both legal justice and social consequences. David Morrison had thought he'd married a compliant accountant who was grateful to support his success from the background. He'd been wrong about everything except my accounting expertise, and that expertise had ultimately destroyed everything he'd built through years of crime and deception. 2 years after David's conviction, I received notification that he'd been denied parole and would serve his full 22-year sentence. The letter included a statement from the parole board noting that David had shown no remorse for his crimes and continued to blame others for consequences that resulted from his own criminal choices. Reading that notification, I felt no satisfaction or vindication, just a quiet sense of closure about a chapter of my life that had ended with appropriate consequences for everyone involved. David would spend the next 2 decades in federal prison, where his arrogance and sense of entitlement would be tested by circumstances very different from the privileged life he'd built through fraud and deception. Jessica would emerge from prison in her early 40s with a criminal criminal record that would prevent her from ever again working in positions that involved financial responsibility or client trust. Robert and Thomas Morrison would lose not just their freedom, but their professional licenses, ensuring that they could never again facilitate the kind of systematic fraud that had characterized Morrison and Associates operations. But most importantly, their convictions had protected countless future victims from financial crimes that would have continued indefinitely if their operations hadn't been exposed and prosecuted. Standing in my apartment on a quiet Sunday morning, drinking coffee while reviewing case files for my next FBI investigation, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since discovering David's hidden tablet. The woman who'd been devastated by her husband's betrayal had become someone who could protect other victims from similar crimes. The wife who'd felt powerless to change her circumstances had become an investigator whose expertise could bring down criminal conspiracies that had operated undetected for years. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless, but it had restored something essential that I'd lost during my marriage to David: absolute confidence in my own judgment capabilities and moral compass. I was no longer someone who could be deceived, manipulated, or underestimated by criminals who believed their charm or social position made them immune to consequences. I was Sarah Chin Morrison, Senior Financial Crimes Consultant with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I was exactly where I belonged. The phone rang, signaling the beginning of another case, another opportunity to use my expertise in service of justice for victims who deserved protection from sophisticated financial criminals. I answered with the confidence of someone who'd learned that truth, patience, and analytical precision were more powerful than any criminal conspiracy. Morrison speaking. How can I help you? The hunt never really ended. It just found new targets who needed to be brought to justice. And I was ready. And that, dear friends, is how Sarah Chin Morrison transformed from a betrayed wife into the architect of perfect justice. Sarah didn't just expose her husband's affair, she dismantled a criminal conspiracy that had been stealing from innocent families for years. Her courage protected countless future victims and showed that sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous when properly motivated. Today, Sarah continues her work with the FBI, using her expertise to bring down financial criminals who prey on trusting people. She found her true calling in the most unexpected way. What did you think of Sarah's story? Have you ever had to find strength you didn't know you possessed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more tales of courage, justice, and women who refuse to be underestimated. Ring that notification bell so you never miss when we share these powerful stories. Until next time, remember, never underestimate the quiet ones. They might just surprise you. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me tonight.